that I think it was Picasso who said that, to create something, you first have to destroy something.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this series episode of the Voctech Podcast, Learning Continued, which seeks to explore the intersection of adult learning and tech. A big shout out to Ufi Charitable Trust and Ufi Ventures who made this new series possible. You can follow online at #Voctech and at Podcast Edtech. Right, this week I'm in conversation with Steve Wheeler, author of Digital Learning in Organisations. For anyone who's in the digital learning space, no doubt you're familiar with Steve. For those of you who aren't, buckle up and listen in to hear some legacy tales about educational technology, training and assessment, and how we might move things forward. This was one of my favourite series recordings, made under the dappled light of an apple tree in Steve's dad's garden in Plymouth in the United Kingdom, and I encourage each of you to check out Ken's Facebook blog on his wartime adventures, which I'll throw in the show notes alongside the link to Steve's latest book and all the references from this episode. I hope you enjoy, and if you'd like to be included in the next episode in our listener feature, just say hello, who you are and what you do in our 90-second voicemail platform at speakpipe.com/the Edtech Podcast. Okay, here we go. I'm really genuinely, deeply delighted to be here because I'm sat in a wonderful English garden just outside of Plymouth city centre, surrounded by flowers and in the sunshine, and I'm here with Steve Wheeler. So welcome, Steve.
Hi, Sophie. Nice to be here.
And we're in your father's garden, and it's absolutely delightful. We're kind of in the dappled light under an apple tree. So
yeah, you can reach up and pick the apples, can't you, from here?
You could. Yeah. I'm going to let them grow a bit bigger.
I would. They're a bit sour at the moment, I think.
Yeah. But just for our listeners, if anyone's been kind of living under a rock or anything like that, as an introduction, so Steve Wheeler is a learning innovations consultant and former associate professor of learning technologies at the Plymouth Institute of Education, where he chaired the Learning Futures Group and led the computing and science education teams. He continues to research into technology-supported learning and distance education, with particular emphasis on the pedagogy underlying the use of social media and Web 2.0 technologies, and also has research interests in mobile learning and cyber cultures. He has given keynotes to audiences in more than 35 countries and is author of over 150 scholarly articles with more than 7,300 academic citations. An active and prolific edu-blogger, his blog Learning with Ease is a regular online commentary on the social and cultural impact of disruptive technologies and the application of digital media in education, learning and development. In the last few years, it has attracted 8.5 million unique visitors. And Steve's latest book, which I'm about a third of the way through, is Digital Learning in Organisations, Help Your Workforce Capitalise on Technologies, which is absolutely perfect for our new series. So welcome again.
Thank you very much. That sounds a bit like me, what you just read there. I think it's off my blog site, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Just a copy and paste, the worst kind. But, over the next 30 minutes, hopefully we'll kind of fill in all the gaps as well. So, Steve, we met for the second time last week during the Learning Technology Summer Forum, and I was lucky enough to buy one of said books. What I thought that I've really enjoyed about it is it's full of personal anecdotes, which I love. And one early on in the book is about your fledgling career as a marmalade maker. So can you expand for our listeners what the underlying message was on training being an investment versus a cost and in your experience there?
Well, I mean, you know the story about the two managers outside the boardroom, and one says, this training's really expensive. What if we train them all up and they leave? And the other one looked at him and said, what if we don't and they stay? It's a kind of, how much cost is ignorance over what we should know as employees. And I think I made the point last week when I was talking about personalised learning at the Summer Forum in London, that actually our whole point about training is to invest in your most important asset, which is human capital, surely. I mean, if you can't see that, then maybe you shouldn't be in business. So, I think people are the most important part of society. They're the most important part. It's we do everything for people, don't we, really? And if we don't invest in people, if we don't train them up, if we don't help them to learn, if we don't give them the opportunities to get the best performance out of themselves, then what are we doing in business? What are we doing in education? Mm-hmm. So the story about the marmalade maker, it was me. I was the marmalade. I was supposed to be on this production line, making marmalade by taking whole huge cans of orange pulp and shoving them into a vat, and then it was being wheeled away, and then I'd start all over again. And the whole point of that was, yes, it was dull work. I was only a kid at the time. I was still at college, and I was trying to earn a few extra quid during the summer holidays, but they didn't tell me the whole story. They told me half the story. And when I opened one of the cans, it opened up and a million black flies flew out. And the whole factory was infested for a whole day. And there was a whole day of production downtime. And that was a costly error. They just didn't tell me what to look out for.
So
probably happened before.
Buzzing. It reminds me of, I grew up on the Isle of Wight. There's a lot of growing cherry tomatoes down there.
Yeah,
so we'd just be packing those and... Yeah, you have the bare minimum training and get the job done. Well,
I think they thought, he's just a kid, he'll get on with it and, get bored and go away, They didn't invest in me. They saw me as only being casual labour, so therefore, but everybody who's in part of an organisation has an important part to play, even if they're casual, I think. So that's the story behind that one.
And then you write in your book about the need to learn and refer to how almost all processes start with some form of creative destruction. Could you sort of expand on that notion as well?
It's a weird thing, isn't it? Creative destruction. It sounds like an oxymoron or something that, contradicts itself. But I think it was Picasso who said that, to create something, you first have to destroy something. And what he meant by that was you have to mix pigments, or you have to move stuff around on a piece of paper. There's always a transformation that takes place, and it can look destructive. And I think the point I was trying to make with that was that not only do we have to learn things, we also have to unlearn certain things before we can relearn other things. For instance, the prejudices you see at the moment, the racist and the xenophobic stuff that you see coming out of the States and the UK at the moment, all this kind of, I don't know, this kind of misplaced zeal in we are Britain or we are the US, it's all based on prejudice, and that is based on bad learning. It's based on false news, false views that are prejudiced, which tend to divide rather than unite. And that's just a classic example of stuff that we really need to unlearn before we can relearn what we need to learn.
I think that's really interesting because I had a podcast recently and the guest was Tara Westover. Do you know her?
No.
She grew up in a kind of extreme Mormon environment where exactly this, she wasn't really encouraged to be schooled in any way. And so eventually she kind of persuaded her parents to let her go to a Mormon university. And then she kind of broke away and made the really painful decision to leave her family, but came and studied at Cambridge. But all of her kind of ideology really was based around this, and so she was extremely homophobic because she just, that was just normal to her, and she kind of had to do, she talks about exactly this, having to kind of really break down everything that's socially constructed for her, and she's got kind of like a really tangential view on everything as a result, a kind of candid example of how these things are built up around us, I suppose.
Well, you see, the thing is, in the age of social media and communication at the speed of thought, which really is the case now. Yeah. Everyone's connected to each other. I think we tend to gather people around us who think the same way and speak the same way and look the same way as we do, and that gives us an echo chamber effect. We get into a bubble like your Mormon friend did, and I think that's unhealthy. I try to gather people around me who maybe will challenge me or disagree with me as well, and occasionally have arguments with them, because that's the best way to learn. I think Hegel nailed this back in the 200 years ago or more when he talked about antithesis and synthesis, bringing together ideas through disagreement and disruption and creative destruction.
The Hegelian dialectic brings me back to my English literature days. I read a Washington Post article recently about Amazon spending $700 million on reskilling learners. They're actually yet to do this. And one of the ladies referenced in this article was Jane Bozarth, who's also mentioned in your book and sounds pretty formidable about taking no prisoners in terms of learning and development. I just wondered if you had personal experience of of what she's like, and if you could kind of
once you've met Jane, you never forget her. Okay. We've shared several stages together over the years, and I notably once in Brussels a couple of years back when I think both of us fell off the stage at one point. Mine was deliberate.
Oh, really?
but
in shock at what someone had said.
No. I mean, she fell off the stage accidentally, and I mimicked her just for a laugh. Really, I shouldn't have done it, but there you go. We know each other quite well, and we can have a good laugh. We often have a joke together. Jane is yes, she is formidable. She's got some formidable ideas about what learning should be, what development should be like, how education should look. I think she's got some great ideas because she's like me, very much the idea that the people are the centre. Yeah. The person is at the centre of the learning. So why should we think about it any other way?
This is quite interesting because it got me thinking about conferences like last week. So people go to them. When you're on your own, you are really inspired by perhaps the sort of forward-thinking things people are saying because you're in that environment of learning. But then you have to kind of go back to your organisation and actually regaling what was said and actually trying to create change is much more difficult. So do you have any kind of tips on how to then go ahead and implement some of that?
Well, it's easy when you're at a conference or in a gathering of people who are like-minded to enthuse and to be evangelized and to be inspired. But you're right, when you go back, it's bumped down to earth, isn't it? Back to base, and you're back in the same old environment where you've worked for the last umpteen years, and suddenly things aren't as easy to enthuse about. And the pressures of work and the pressures of relationships and so on get on top of you. So for me, there are fundamental, I think, ideas. One of them, as I've already mentioned, is the person at the centre, and another one is to stand up for what you believe is true and actually stand your ground. And even if you're being heavily criticised, be that positive deviant, be that person who makes that different idea happen in the work. Be that person who is courageous and doesn't deviate from the pathway that they know they've got to step up to. Yeah, I got into trouble a few times when I was working at Plymouth University, but it wasn't trouble in as much that, they'd look at me and think, oh, he's done it again, because they knew that I'd get results. Yeah. So although they would criticise me, they wouldn't be able to sanction me because they knew that I would get the results by doing things differently.
So sort of beg forgiveness, not permission.
That's exactly my mantra, yeah. It's exactly the way I worked. And so, for instance, I took it upon myself to change the assessment mode on one occasion. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't go through any paperwork. I didn't go through any regulations. I just changed it. And I said to the students, okay, you've got a 5,000-word assignment to write for me. I'm going to tell you that's equivalent. And that means that you can do other things as well. So someone said, can I do a video? I said, yeah, come up and discuss with me what the equivalency would be in terms of 5,000 words and make sure that you apply the assessment criteria and we'll be fine. Someone else said, I'll do a series of podcasts. Might have been you, actually. Yeah. It wasn't. But and somebody else said, can I do an exhibition? And I said, yeah, fine, okay, whatever you want to, be creative in it and go off and do it. Someone did a series of blogs, others created a wiki space and got people to comment on their work. And at the end of it all, the admin staff said to me, okay, where are all the printouts of all the assignments? I said, I'm not going to give you printouts. They said, what? But the assessment, it needs, the regulations state that we need printouts of everything. I said, well, good luck printing out a video. You can't do it. And they said, well, the external examiner is going to go up the wall about this. He's going to go, ballistic. I said, give me the phone. So I picked up the phone and spoke to him. And I said, Doug, what do you feel about this? And I went through all the ideas with him. And he said, brilliant idea. I applaud you for doing that. He said, break out of the mold. Let's do something different. And eventually the admin people, the professional services, they called themselves, they ran out of complaints. They ran out of objections and they had to let me do it. And now, across the whole university, lots of people are doing alternative assignments. Mm-hmm. It takes somebody, I think, to stand up and with the conviction and the courage to actually to do something different. And, I was down the road in my career. And for me, what could they do to me? Could they sack me? Well, maybe, but would I care? So in the end, I had nothing to lose and a lot to gain. And it worked.
I love that. It makes me think of, I always think, not that I'm relating to an old lady on the bus, but when they're kind of like there in their Nike Air Maxes and they're like, I just don't care. I'm going to wear whatever I want.
Yeah. Don't give a monkeys. I mean, and I think sometimes, that is the way to be. That's the way to implement change. It does take sometimes just one person who is an opinion leader or someone who is senior enough to be able to get away with it. I wouldn't recommend it to everybody to do that because, some people might lose their jobs over it. It does. It's about context.
Yeah. On that basis, is there a skills crisis or are we crap at utilising existing talent, for example, female professionals and those without traditional qualifications?
Well, that's a really big question, isn't it? I mean, we talk about the divide between academia and vocational training, and often I think the root cause is found in secondary school. I'm not lambasting secondary school teachers. My wife is one. I have a lot of friends who are secondary school teachers, but sometimes secondary education gets it wrong and they push children into academia when in fact maybe they should be sending them down to the local FE college to train as a bricklayer or a hairdresser or somebody who wants to work with their hands rather than work with their minds. Not every child, not every person is suited to academia. Hence, we do get a problem now where there's a lot of unemployed graduates in this country and other countries in the Western industrialized world. And there's also a lot of skills shortage because we haven't trained enough people up in the manual and the kind of the technical areas of our society. So I think there is a skills shortage, probably because that's one of the reasons. I think it's more complex than that. I'm maybe distilling it down into something simplistic, but I think that's one of the reasons.
And there's all these inquiries. There's another inquiry announced this week about lifelong learning. And I saw someone comment that was like, we need an inquiry about why there's so many lifelong learning inquiries without an outcome. I mean, it's been talked about for so long, hasn't it? And it's sort of...
I think we're a very outcome-based society, and that's based on metrics, which is based on successive governments' desire to show that they are better than anybody else in the world. I mean, one of the things I guess we could point the finger at there is PISA. The post-16, it's a 16-year-old. They test 16-year-olds in maths and in literacy at some point during that year, and then they post those results in a national kind of grading system, and that's PISA, PISA. Look it up. But the thing is,
I've interviewed Andreas Schleicher, so yeah.
Well, Andreas Schleicher is actually a proponent of that, isn't he? Whereas I'm an opponent of it, and I'd happily sit down and talk. I'd never met the guy, but I would happily sit down and talk to him about it and discuss this with him in great detail, because for me this sounds like. Well, it's setting everybody up for failure, really. I mean, there are very few nations that rise to the top each year. I mean, Singapore and Finland have always been near the top. Singapore, their system is completely different to the Finnish system. But the thing is, Finnish teachers have a lot more freedom than British teachers. Singapore teachers do a lot of didactic type of teaching because that's what their society requires. It's a very complex area to try and unravel and to try and analyze, but personally, my view is that we should not be putting children through such high-stakes testing at such an early age, adding stress onto stress onto stress for them and their parents and their families and the teachers in the school and the administrators, just to satisfy a government's whim on we want to be at the top of the table.
And on metrics in sort of the corporate training world, what's your view on sort of where people focus on compliance versus performance, and then just going back to Jane Bozarth, trying to nurture that individual employee and how they may personally develop as well?
Oh gosh, again, this is such a complex area because you need some compliance training. I mean, even things like diversity training now. These are things that are important because people need to be informed, people need to be safe, people need to be well versed in what is required of them to improve their performance, but that's not the full story. I mean, there's so much more learning that can be done, which is probably informal or personal learning, as I call it, rather than personalized learning. And it's stifled because people just haven't got the time to do it. They're constantly bombarded with regulations and constantly bombarded with jumping through this hoop and that hoop. It's a wonder people have got time to do their work these days, really.
And that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's like, the big driver seems to be productivity, and that's why sort of the training seems to get slightly sidelined by it.
There's a company in Australia, I'm trying to remember the name, you can probably look it up because it's quite a well-known case, but once a month they have one single day when they say to the employees, it's a software developing company, they say to their employees, you can go off and for the next 8 hours create what you want. The only thing that we want from you is come back and show us what you've devised at the end of the day. If it's nothing, then fine. Nothing is gained, nothing lost. But if you've found something important, come and show us. And they have discovered that one day of unproductivity, if you like, has become the most productive day in the whole of the month, because these people go off and they pursue their passion rather than their compliance or their performance. And they go off and they pursue their passion, and they look at stuff that they're really fascinated with, stuff that they really want to know more about. And they go off and they find out in great detail about it. They create things. They create software fixes, new apps. There's a whole range of stuff that they do which would never be on the agenda for that organisation.
Having that mind space to think about.
It is. It's simply that. And Google do the same thing, and so do other big, I suppose, tech giant companies. They give their staff space, headspace, to go off and create. And there's your creative destruction again.
I read your chapter on learning myths. Pedagogically, do you think the average learning and development department is slightly behind formal education? Well, formal could be a contentious word there, but I meant schools and higher ed and so on.
Do you know, I've always said that in the 4 sectors, primary, secondary, tertiary, and learning and development area organisations, there's always one that comes out in front. And surprisingly, it's the primary school. It's primary sector, because there's no high stakes testing there. They've got very few risks to take. So they become the most innovative of all of the 4 sectors in terms of the pedagogy that they
so sad,
create.
Isn't it?
Well, it is, because by the time children get into secondary school, at the end of it, they've had it all knocked out of them, because it becomes very formalised then, to use that word that you used earlier on. But by the time they get into tertiary education, they're now being spoon-fed. They want to be spoon-fed because that's what they're used to. And when if they leave there or take that route through into an organisation, they've been conditioned. I mean, Sir Ken Robinson talks about this, Stephen Heppel talks about this, all the way back in history of time. John Holt, Paulo Freire, even Illich. I could go on and on mentioning all these theorists from the last century as well, who talked about the problems with formal education and the need for unschooling and deschooling.
So if any L&D people are listening in, sort of say no to VAC.
VAK is well, Neil Fleming is a lovely guy. I've spoken to him a couple of times, but the idea of putting people into categories and saying, oh, he's a visual learner, she's an audio learner, that does a disservice to all of them, because what you're doing is you're robbing them of the chance to expand their repertoire. Nobody fits into one single category. It's been proved time and time again. You read the work of people like Catherine Eccleston and people like, I'm trying to think of the guy's name now, it'll come to me in a minute, people who have done the reports, the meta-studies on all of the learning styles inventories and all of the categorization cult, as I call it. And there's not a single shred of evidence that these learning styles actually exist.
Yeah.
Most of us are all of those, and we change according to context. Now, that's a fact.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know that from personal experience, because sometimes people are like, why don't you do video? And it's like, well, when I'm walking along, I don't want to kind of look at a video either.
Well, I think we all have to learn to multitask in today's society. We all have to kind of do many things at once, and we're all different. We're all unique. At the summer forum last week, I showed several slides and asked people to decide what they saw in front of them. And the first one was the colour blindness test. We determined that in the room there were 3 or 4 different types of colour blindness, including mine. We all have these differences in our visual capabilities to begin with, but then you look at the perceptual capabilities that we have. The final one was a Rorschach ink blot test, and everyone saw something different in it. 50 or 60 people in the room, and they all saw something different. So it just shows that we see things differently, we perceive things differently. How can we all be treated in the same way?
Yeah, yeah.
One size does not fit all.
So are there any companies that you think are being really smart about their learning and development?
Yeah, the Royal Mail, for a start. I mean, I mentioned this in my new book. The Royal Mail have actually developed with a local software company called Sponge, based up 4 miles up the road here, developed AR and VR, augmented and virtual reality applications, which can be used on the spot. So as a postal worker is delivering a package, they come up against a problem, they can open up their app on their smartphone and see instantly without having to phone to anybody or go back for more training or to divert their performance. They can look straight through the app, through the screen, and it will overlay information for them as to what to do next. This, for me, is direct learning transfer. This is situated learning. This is authentic education and training.
So I absolutely love this example, and actually I'm quite excited because I'm interviewing the MD at Sponge, and they're hopefully putting me in contact with the Royal Mail about sort of using VR with about aggressive dogs and how to handle them.
Yeah, wow, it's so many postal workers. I mean, we laugh, but it's a serious thing because you get an injury and you could be off work for a long time. You could lose a hand.
Yeah.
It's a serious business, and the more we can do to assuage that kind of problem and to obviate what they go through, the better, really.
Well, then you think about what sometimes they're delivering. They probably think, for this piece of junk,
yeah. I mean, some of the parcels they deliver these days, I think we're sending less and less letters, but more and more heavy objects through the mail. Amazon and eBay and so on. All these online companies are sending out these huge parcels, and of course, who delivers it? Postal workers.
I don't know if you know this person's work. So I came across the work of David Graeber, is it? Or Graeber? Bullshit Jobs. Have you seen this?
Nope.
So The Guardian sort of summarised it as, is your job one that makes the world a better place? If not, it's probably bullshit, part of a system that is keeping us under control. And this author, an academic, was on, I think it's Joe Rogan's podcast.
Yeah.
And basically his premise is that lots of people, and especially in organisations when they get so big, are literally in the department doing a job that they've just been told to do. No one actually really knows they're doing it anymore. And they're just doing it because that's what they've been assigned to. And it's really unfulfilling for them. And they know that if they didn't do it, it wouldn't make any difference one way or another. But, essentially it pays their wage. And what do you think about that?
It's like the Catch-22, the Soldier in White. Have you read that book, Joseph Heller's book?
I've read, Catch-22, yeah.
Well, in Catch-22, there's a soldier, and he's completely encased from head to foot in white plaster, and his arms are up and his legs are up, and they've got a tube running into the top of him and a tube running out from the bottom, and every so often they change the tubes around.
That is gross. Yeah.
That is an allegory, I think, or a metaphor, if you like, for what you've just mentioned. So, I guess in large organisations there are people who are doing jobs that they think perhaps, and maybe they are, maybe they don't actually make a difference. But I would contend with this guy. Was it David Graeber? I would contend with him that not all jobs have to make a difference to people. Make our lives easier. I think there are aesthetic jobs, so musicians and artists, for instance, and I have both of those kind of in my repertoire. I trained as a graphic designer and a fine artist, and I've also been a professional musician for 7 years. So for me, that's not making people's lives easier, but it entertains and it gives them an aesthetic kind of belief in something better, that they can aspire to, for instance. So not all jobs have to make people's lives easier.
Well, it's like the whole university debate about value, and is it just about creating a job, or is it, also fulfilling in that way as well, and kind of wider civic value and that kind of thing. So one thing that last week also made me think is how much of sort of our discussion around learning and development still has in mind this idea of going into an office and then training being for a team that go into an office, whether that's one office or offices around the world. And, for perhaps younger employees and increasingly any employee in distributed teams or working for themselves or, being freelancers and that kind of things. For those people and those employees, would you have any advice around how they can also keep themselves, sharp and trained and motivated?
Yeah, it's about following your passion again, isn't it, really? It's about breaking out of the mould. It's about seeing things slightly differently to the way that you're used to seeing them. So forcing yourself into unfamiliar situations, forcing yourself almost to argue with people who you feel uncomfortable being with. I've had several heated exchanges on Twitter, and one or two notorious ones with well-known people who don't agree with my views, and that's fine. They're allowed to disagree, but it's the outworking of the discussion and the arguments that you have, and scoring points off each other. That's the important thing, because that gives you a broader perspective on what your life and what your work should really be about. And it goes back to, do you remember Second Life? It was about, 10 to 12 years ago. It was quite popular. It was a multi-user virtual environment which you could go into for free and move around it and create things and so on. And they sold land off to various universities. And I don't know who's in there now. It's probably a ghost town, but they'd probably died to death because it was so difficult to use. But the thing was, a lot of universities went in there and created virtual campuses. And you know what they did? They created buildings with ceilings and floors and walls and seats in an environment where you can force the weather into any way you want it to go. So what they were doing was perpetuating the always done it this way kind of myth.
Yeah.
So when I went in and created my multi-user virtual environment, we had an open air auditorium with massive butterflies flying around, which you could ride on. Seats that you sat on and bounced, they were like toadstools, but they were in the air. And we had a skybox where you could go up and have a private conversation. You could teleport yourself up, and so on. And we did that as a kind of an AIDS, HIV and AIDS information space. And people used it because it was different.
Because it's fun as well.
Because you could do it. It was fantasy, but it was also reality. It was grounded in reality. It was about people talking about their health issues. It was about people, wanting to have a confidential chat with an expert. And people flocked to it, and I think we wrote the first research paper on it back in 2007. It's still out there somewhere. It's had a lot of citations because it was the first one. But we discovered a lot about breaking the mold there, and about changing the status quo and doing something different, being the positive deviant again.
So your blog's called Learning with Ease.
Yep.
I'm sure it's not a reference to the Shaman and Ebenezer goods, or is it?
No, it's just a silly play on words, and I thought, well, I might as well use it before someone else does, because it sounds catchy. Yeah, and it certainly caught on, and the book came out based on that, of course, about 3 or 4 years ago. So, I mean, learning with ease. A lot of people have said, "Oh, it's to do with ecstasy or whatever," But no, it's just simply a play on words, and I think we should learn with ease because we are natural born learners, and technology helps us to improve that further and extend our abilities, extend our capabilities. Andy Clark calls us natural born cyborgs, and we are. We use technology as an extension of our senses and of our body and of our mind. So to learn with ease, but that doesn't belie the fact that also learning is in the struggle. So it's a balance, really. So learning with ease is fine, but learning also with a struggle now and again, I think is important.
You recently wrote on a blog post called Second Chance OU 50. I left school with nothing, no qualifications, not a sausage. Most of the teachers in the schools I attended, I was a forces kid and went to 9 during my school years, didn't seem to care and failed to motivate me to study. I simply wasn't interested. So for our listeners, can you tell us how that story finishes?
Well, there were 1 or 2 teachers there, both Americans actually. I was an American high school was my last school in Holland. Dad was based in the Royal Air Force there. And so for 2 years there, although I did nothing, I was bored solid. and I often just didn't go to classes because it was just, I was being talked at and told to sit in a chair and not to move around, when in fact my way of learning is to move around a lot. So these 2 teachers both inspired me because both of them turned a blind eye when I sneaked into the back of their lessons to learn. One was the art teacher, one was a music teacher. Back in them days, the curriculum wasn't balanced. As a boy, you could not do art and music. You could do one or the other. Girls could do both. Boys could only do one. Girls could only do 1 science. Boys could do 3. It was ridiculous, an outrageous, genderized kind of environment. And I kicked against that. So I used to sit in the back of the music lessons. And Larry, as we call him, he let us use his first name, and really liberal arts teacher.
So the arts teachers, isn't it? They're often like this, though, at the outlet.
Well, Larry was a great musician, and he used to sit me in the back. He said, "Sit in the back there, you'll be fine." He said, "I won't tell anyone, and if someone asks, were you there, I should deny it." Fine, okay. And he said, "You can't take the exams," he said, "but you can actually take part in all of the productions." So I took part in several musicals, Fiddler on the Roof and various other musicals that we did. Oliver, I think we did, and part of the rock choir that we had there. We did all the latest rock songs as a choir, and we played lunchtime gigs, and I learned to play the guitar while I was there. And it inspired me to go on and follow my dreams. But the thing is, because I left school with no formal qualifications, and then I went to art college, they accepted me on the basis that I had an art O-level. That was the only thing I went out with, an art GCE as it was at the time. They accepted me on the basis of that. And for 2 years, I went to Herefordshire College of Art and trained as a fine artist and then as a photographer and a graphic designer. That took me into another job at a place called Marjohn's, which is up the hill here, which is a teacher training college. And I moved back to Plymouth. And from that, I got introduced to a brand new discipline called educational technology. And it was just starting at the time. This was the 1970s, the kind of mid-70s, so 75. And there were very few people involved in that area because it was such a brand new area. And at the time, we were looking at things like the emergence of video. Personal computers hadn't arrived. It wouldn't arrive for another 3 or 4 years. We were looking at things like classroom technologies. We were looking at things like recording and editing and projection facilities, those kind of things. And the early theory behind all that, even distance education was quite new then. But at that point, you mentioned the Open University. When I was about 5 years, 6 years into that, my wife and I had met and we'd started to have children. And I thought, I'm in a dead-end job here. I'm in a technical job here, which I've got no hopes for promotion of. I've got a wife, 3 kids, and Plymouth Argyle to support. And really, how am I...
They're probably doing better then.
They were doing better then, yeah. And the thing is, what am I going to do with my life? And so I thought, I'm going to have to go off and do something different. And so at that point, I started teaching the nurses. I was now in the NHS. I started teaching nurses how to use computers. And my boss, who was very far-sighted, she said, you should go off and train as a teacher. So I did an evening class for 2 years, got my Cert Ed, which in them days you could do before a degree.
Yeah.
Nowadays you do the PGC after a degree. So I did that first and I thought I wanted to go and do a degree now. So I went off and I paid for myself to do a degree at the Open University in psychology. And they said to me, and ever the positive deviant, they said to me, it'll take you 5 years to do it. I said, I'll do it in 3. They said, no, you won't. I said, yes, I will. And they said, you can't. It's impossible to do it in 3 years because it's the workload is too much. I said, well, I'll show you 3 ways that I'll do it differently, and I did. And I got a first-class honours degree because I was determined. I followed my dream. I was thinking about Larry again, the music teacher.
Yeah.
Follow my dream. And then the university took interest in me and said, would you like to come and work for us? And so they said to me, what would you like from us? This is a research program. They said, what would you like from us? I said, I'd like to do a PhD, please. They said, welcome. And there it is. So and from that point on, I was a member of the Plymouth University staff. Well, 2 years later, in fact, after the research program finished, and I managed that research program. That was breaking new ground as well because we were setting up tele-learning centres. This was in the, I suppose, the mid-90s, and we were setting up tele-learning centres across the rural areas of southwest England in places where they'd never set up these things before. So we had fast internet connections and video conferencing and digital satellite transmissions, all very, very new stuff in them days. And my job was to go in and set it up and then research it. And that's where most of my early publications came from. And then, of course, in 98, I joined the Faculty of Education, as it was then, as a full-time lecturer. So there you are.
So it all ended well.
It's a convoluted story, but follow your dream is the...
And don't let other people tell you where your limits are.
Well, I've never let people define me. I define myself. I am the captain of my own ship, and occasionally
naval reference.
Well, it is, yeah. We're in a naval port, aren't we?
Yeah.
But the point is that if you steer your own ship, then sometimes you're going to get into difficulty, and you'll need people around you to help you and advise you, and never negate that. But you are your own destiny, and if you decide you want to do something, then go and do it.
It is funny what you mentioned about going into the art class, because at my school, a lot of my friends were doing art and at a different time to me. So I'd go in and hide under the desk, and the teacher would come in and he was like a family friend and he'd be like, Sophie, I can see you under the desk, and I'd have to come back out. But like,
was that kind of performance art, was it?
No, unfortunately not. Well, I wasn't a very good magician. Unfortunately, I wasn't hiding well enough. You have a whole chapter on simulation for learning in your book, which is one of the chapters I didn't make before our interview. We've looked at simulation previously on the podcast in relation to surgical training, empathy building and nuclear power plant training. But what was the chapter about? And
there's a combination, isn't it?
Yeah.
You do all three at once.
Not all in one. Not all in one.
Be complicated, wouldn't it? I think that simulation is quite an interesting idea because it puts you into the situation before you actually reach the real situation. So in effect, it's like rehearsal, but it's rehearsal that's kind of immersive rehearsal. And so I think one of the first things I was involved in was just across the road here. There's a big railway junction, and sometimes you can hear the trains going by. And the idea behind that was that the NHS at the time were going to simulate a major disaster with all the services involved in it. So what happened was the NHS said to me, "Would you like to come over with your crew and record, capture it all on video?" I said, "Yeah, when is it?" It's Sunday morning at 7:00. Blinking out. Right, okay. So I got an assistant with me, and the two of us went over, and we sat there and waited. And they called people out as if it was a real kind of incident. And the point being that it was a shock kind of effect, really. And what happened was they all arrived. There was something like about 20 ambulances there, 15 police cars, a whole load of fire engines. And when they arrived there, they had the casualty union there, and all these people were dressed up with wounds and broken legs and things, people screaming in agony, and it looked quite realistic, blood everywhere, gore all over the place. And these people had to go in as if it was real, and actually solve the situation, resolve it, rescue people, cut people out. They had the cutting equipment there. They had an old carriage there which they could cut up and so on. And I filmed a whole lot of it. Now, that was a simulation. From that, the video was used as a training resource. We edited it down and created a 20-minute training resource with questions that popped up in it and so on. So, in effect, it had two effects, because firstly, it was a simulation, and secondly, it was an archive, an archive resource. And that was a very powerful thing, because it gave people insight into things that they could and maybe shouldn't do, the micro and the macro effects of a major accident. So that was one form of simulation, but there's so many other ways you can do this.
That's interesting, because I've got a recording coming up with one of the L&D leads for the NHS from a sort of overview of all the trusts, as it were. So if you were doing the recording, what questions would you ask so I can steal them?
The questions I would probably ask is, firstly, what do you want to achieve with your employees? So obviously it's to inform them of all the possible issues and problems. Safety first, obviously. Be safe yourself. Then, when do you intervene? How do you intervene? What do you intervene with? Who else is involved? All these kind of questions, I think, are logistical questions, but they're also operational questions that will make the difference to maybe saving someone's life. But also, there are other issues around this, like, what do we do with the general public? How do we...
Now everyone stands around filming the thing, don't they?
Well, yeah, they do these days, yeah. In them days, video was very expensive and nobody had cameras.
Yeah.
So nobody had phones, definitely. So there's lots of questions like that, questions around, I'm not talking just performance here, I'm talking about saving lives now. So that's the really important thing, isn't it?
You're a keen music enthusiast, even titling some of your chapters with David Bowie references. Bowie. What are a couple of your favourite vinyl, if that's your medium of choice? Or is it more the process of digging around for good music that you love?
I've got a radio show called Just Vinyl. It goes out every Wednesday and Sunday down here, and also in the Midlands, I think, as well. We've got a couple of, and up northeast, got a couple of syndicated versions of it. It's called Just Vinyl. Now, that says what it says. I only play vinyl, so I play stuff from the 70s and 80s mainly, and maybe the 90s. I like a lot of stuff. I am a rock musician. I'm rock through and through, but within that there's so many subgenres. I like blues. I like jazz rock, actually. I mean, Brand X and Phil Collins, Genesis, obviously, were one of my inspirations. I've got everything they ever did, all the way back to the Beatles, actually, the 60s vinyl. Genesis
just reminds me of American Psycho, in the he always references Genesis.
Yeah, well, yeah, but that's that's an anomaly, because most people who like Genesis are very nice people.
That's true. I will take your word for it.
But I also love a lot of the progressive rock, people like Supertramp, and I play them in the car all the time. But I like the latest stuff as well. So I'm into people like Ed Sheeran and Rihanna, and some of the latest bands. Arcade Fire, have you heard them?
Yeah, I've seen them live.
They're phenomenal.
Yeah, they're quite good.
Everything. Have you heard of them?
I have heard of them, but I don't know them so well.
Get into them.
Yeah.
These guys are. It's kind of. indie rock, but it's more than that. It's got the zeitgeist within it. You know, you listen to it and you get a keen insight into what's going on. And Stormzy, love Stormzy's work.
Yeah, that Glastonbury performance is pretty amazing.
His headlining set at Glastonbury was just amazing.
Yeah.
And
I found out the other day that Mark Martins, or Urban Teacher, used to teach them. Used to teach Stormzy, yeah.
Did he really? Well, he did a good job.
Yeah.
Apart from his potty mouth.
Yeah.
But anyway, no, we can
pull your trousers up.
We can overlook that, yeah. You pull your trousers up, yeah. We don't do that today. But the thing that I think my kids are surprised about is that I listen to a lot of synesthesia and house stuff as well, you know. A lot of what we used to call European dance music, but now it's kind of synesthesia and, you know, chill out stuff, you know. So my tastes are quite eclectic, actually.
And are there any good record shops in the southwest people should know about?
The vinyl shop that I go to occasionally is on Breton side. That's the only vinyl shop that I know in the southwest. Normally I'd go elsewhere. So I know a lovely vinyl shop up the top of the road in Sheffield.
Okay.
When I go to Sheffield University to work there, there's a vinyl record shop up near one of my favourite curry houses, and I often go in there and rifle through and buy discs. Yeah, I'm a real vinyl freak, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll know what present to get you next time after your pin badge. And just finally, what's next for you? So, how, you know, first of all, if people want to connect with you, find out more, where should they go? And then what's next?
Well, Steve at steve-wheeler.net is my email account. And steve-wheeler.net is also my professional site. But the blog site is steve-wheeler.co.uk. That's where most of my writings appear. So I'll be doing a special blog post tomorrow for the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, which I remember seeing as a 12-year-old.
That's bonkers.
So you can work out my age. And I remember watching that, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning as a 12-year-old in the Shetland Islands, of all places, in a little croft where there was no running water. We had electricity, obviously, because we could watch television in black and white telly, and I sat up and watched the ghostly images of Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon. And I'd already built a replica of the Saturn V rocket, which was taller than me.
Wow! What did you build it out of?
It's Airfix kit, and it cost a lot of money. I think you know, I had to buy it in stages. Get it? But the point is, these things inspired me, and so you know that's the kind of stuff I write about now. So that's how you get hold of me. And what's next? Well, I've got a new job actually. It's only a part-time job, but I wanted to get back into teaching after a couple of years away. So I can announce officially that I'm about to join Marjohn's again, the Truro site, as a master's tutor on the research modules. And I'm looking forward to that. It's only part-time, as I say. Gives me time to do loads of other things. I've got various contracts with large companies and smaller companies that I'm working with, either as a professional writer or as a consultant. So there's a few things on the horizon, and I'll probably write a new book, but I'm going to give it a year or so. Still lifelong learner? Always. You never stop learning until you've carried out feet first. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. That's all for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening in, and I do hope you enjoyed and found some gems of inspiration to take away with you. Don't forget that for events you might be interested in around the world, you can go to theedtechpodcast.com/events, where we aim to aggregate as many as we can. And this week's featured event is the Higher Ed Summit Horizons, which takes place on the 10th of October in Paris, France. And there's a special code for our listeners, which is EdTech50. Which allows you to get 50% off the ticket. That's all for now. Thank you for subscribing and listening, and goodbye.